It's a great pleasure and honor to be here, to be invited to come to speak with you all and to welcome me so warmly. And it's a singular pleasure to have Paul introduce me. I met Paul years ago, as he mentioned. I think I was probably like 27 years old. And we first met when Paul and Dan Rose were editors of the series in contemporary ethnography with University of Pennsylvania Press. And I particularly appreciated then this kind of guiding support and encouragement. I was just learning how to write. I was trying to transform my PhD into a first book. And, Paul and Dan and Patricia really were great in how they encouraged me in a kind of gentle, but, a kind of sort of, formative way. So I really appreciate that. And I'm pleased that somehow we're both in Erlangen at the same time and we have a chance to say hello. So I'm going to talk today to a kind of overview of my work through the past years, and particularly with the idea that this is going to provide a kind of grounding for tomorrow's workshop, to give you a sense of some key themes that I've been working on and sort of how they have developed through time. And the metaphor I'm going to use is an archipelago of thought and writing. So if you can imagine an archipelago with these different islands, we're going to go through a series of them. So I invite you to sort of, imagine that you're on a boat and it's a nice day and you're welcome to use your sunglasses. And we're going to visit a few of these islands. But while also keeping in mind that any archipelago has underlying structures, possible fault lines as well. So we can keep that in mind. So just a metaphor to work with. And so some of the themes that we're going to visit are these themes of body, presence, and phantasm. That's in the title, but it could just as easily have been experience, poesis, image, life, death. And this is one of the key questions that I think motivates a lot of my work. How might we go about understanding the complicated and ever-shifting nuances of bodily experience, sensory perception, memory and time, and hardness and healing in our lives and the lives of others? So this is something people often ask me, like, you've done such different projects in Nepal, in the United States, now in France. Why are you doing it that way? It just seems so random. But for me, there's this underlying sort of continuous thread, which is sort of, as Paul had noted, is really a concern with life and experience and subjectivity, intersubjectivity. Each project sort of works along those lines. So these are some of the fields I've worked in: the fields of medical anthropology, psychological anthropology, sociocultural, and my work touches on the anthropology of religion and phenomenological anthropology. And particularly, a lot of my work really comes down to questions of bodily experience, emotions and affect, sensory perception, illness and hardship, and ritual transformations, and these domains of subjectivity and intersubjectivity. And recurrent is this figure of the human. How does the human take form in particular places? What are the various dimensions of it, the various vicissitudes and possibilities within that? And it's true that a lot of my work is really devoted to a kind of critical phenomenology. In my work, along with others, there's a commitment to critical phenomenological approaches in anthropology. And this, pertains to my research on illness, healing, and bodily sensibilities among Yomo people in the Nepal Himalayas, to critical reflections on experience and selfhood among residents in a homeless shelter in Boston, Massachusetts, to my more recent work into images and phantasms and spectrality in Paris and now in Berlin as well. So I've been deeply invested in trying to understand, within the frames of a critical phenomenology, the gist of life, death, hardship, and healing in various domains of existence in the contemporary world. So I can't really say my first body of work, but a very important first formation of my work was with Nepal. And I started doing fieldwork there in a serious way in 1988. And continuing it up until the last few years, and I've sort of moved on to other things. So there's 3 books that I think of it as a trilogy of works that I've done with Yomo people, and I'll come back to each of those. The first one that was published, and again with the series in contemporary ethnography, is Body and Emotion: The Aesthetics of Illness and Healing in the Nepal Himalayas, which came out in 1992. And this is based on fieldwork I did in the Yomo region, particularly centered in this one village that I lived in, Gofurbanjang, and the neighboring villages. So this is a photograph of Nepal. I don't know if the Yomo region is just above Kathmandu, sort of where the T and H of Kathmandu is sort of there in the foothills, and it's like a one very long day's hike from the Kathmandu Valley up there. Quicker these days now that the roads have been built, but this gives you a sense of the terrain there. I'm just going to show some images of people who live in that area that I've taken at different times during my field work. It's very multi-ethnic region with different with people who identify as different ethnic identities living in the same villages, and most of my work is focused on the Yomo people that live sort of in that particular area of Nepal. The Yomo people are Tibetan Buddhist people, particularly associated with the Nyingma traditions of Tibetan Buddhism, and this is a gompa that had been built there recently. This is a photograph here that I took in 1988. And so one of the things, and I think there's several of us who've done long-term fieldwork with people. Sometimes it kind of strikes me that I know 4 generations of certain families there, and I think there's that in-depth work and engagement with life as my life continues on as well. That's worth noting. This was a Losar festival, I believe, in February 1988 when I was there doing fieldwork. No, it must have been 1989. And there is me getting a blessing as well. I think I look the same, so I hope you agree. This is the healer I worked with, who is a very important person for me to work with. And I've written about Dupsang Bumbo. And one of the key methods of my research then was I became an apprentice to him as a healer. Bumbo means healer, very much a kind of shamanic orientation, which we can talk about. And I would often go visit him in his home. During the day, he was a farmer, but he was also recognized as a very skilled healer and very powerful with the energies he could summon up. So these are photographs I had taken at different times during our engagements together. This is a photograph taken with his several members of his family. And one way you can sort of configure it is this is where his home is, up on that ridge, up on the mountaintop, but that's where Goful Banjang is. So that's where I was living, and I would come to his house. It would take like an hour to walk around the edge of that mountain there and visit him. And often I would go to healing ceremonies with him. This is the start of one healing ceremony. You can see this is the back of the room. These are what are known as the Torma figures. These represent different deities, Buddhist deities that he works with in a very developed way. And you can see here I'm sitting next to him. And the idea is that he was teaching me how to become a Bumbo. And I would try to explain that actually this is, I'm working on my dissertation. I'm going to work on a book on that. I'm not quite sure he ever fully understood that, because he would often say, when you go back to your country, make sure you play the drum this way. But it was very clear that I was learning from him in a kind of dedicated way. This is a photograph during the first times encountered him, and in Body Emotion, the subtitle is a kind of intriguing thing, the author in trance. So we can come back to that. This is he's known as Meme Bumbo, which is a kind of, Meme is an honorific, it means grandfather in a way. This is him performing a divination. And there's a kind of intricate sort of ritual process where he asks questions and counts out different kinds of rice and eventually comes to an answer. And this morning, a woman had come to him and said that their water buffalo was sick. And so her family wanted him to come and to sort of identify the cause of the illness and how to remediate it. So we did go to the house, and this elaborate ritual where they were basically extracting a negative energy from the water buffalo, transferring it to the chicken, and then offering the chicken as a sacrifice to certain deities. And so this is part of the logic, which I write about in Body and Emotion. Here he's exercising a demon, a very demonic force that had come into someone's house, and through an all-light ritual. One of the things I focus on, and it's in the first article, Presence, that we'll be discussing tomorrow, are these spirit calling rites, the la kuk, hooking the spirit, calling it back. And this is a woman that would have been identified as having spirit loss, a la calcine, she had lost her spirit. And this is an elaborate ritual process to bring back the spirit into her body and into her life, where the healer, the Bumbo, will leave in a kind of magical flight. His own spirit will go out looking for the lost spirit in the countryside and then bring it back. And this is something I write about in the Presence article. This is a similar rite. This is actually to bring back the soul of a person, the kind of vitality, the strength of a person. And this was a man who I'd gotten to know, and he felt he was feeling particularly weak through one winter season. And this is an attempt to bring back his strength, his power. This is the table of contents. So one thing to note, now that I'm living in Berlin, I don't have a lot of my books. Any of the books we'll be discussing tomorrow, I don't have. They're back in New York. So I've been going onto like Google Books and Amazon to refer myself to certain things. And this is the structure of body and emotion. The chapters, the first section is on loss, and the second section is on healing. And you can see some of the themes that come into play here. And these are some of the key concerns in body and emotion. Experiences of illness and healing among Yomo people, and what I came to call the aesthetic sensibilities of everyday life. These themes that I was noticing when I was doing field work of balance, of harmony, of integration, not just within the body, but within a family, within a person's life, within a community, and the sensorial and emotional dimensions of life. And very much this kind of work, several of us were doing this kind of work, including Paul's very important seminal work on this field, the anthropology of the bodies, the senses, emotions, and illness and healing. And this is a photograph that I couldn't resist doing a screenshot of the Presence article. And I remember working with Carol Laderman and Marina Roseman on this book, and they said they really liked this image that somehow conveyed the sense of presence in everyday life. So again, the sense of the spirit loss, the la calcine, when someone loses their la, their spirit, they don't have the energy they normally have in life. They don't feel like talking with other people, eating foods, the way people describe it, going up the hill to visit another family. And one of the things that sort of, struck me, it's kind of, self-evident, is that there's affinities with depression. And our clinical notions of depression in Europe and North America, that we lose this sense of a spirit. But you could really trace out two very different genealogies, the difference between spirit loss and depression. One of the things that's different is that for Yomo people, they don't blame themselves if they lose their spirit, and no one else blames it. It's just something that's happened. Usually they've been startled by something or spooked, and the spirit leaves. And in contrast to depression, there's often a sense of the person is blamed for not having this kind of industrious will in life anymore. And I think there's reasons, that whole history that shapes that impression. And again, this is another image that shows the spirit hooking ceremony, which I write about in the Presence article. And this is one of the main sort of arguments in that Presence article. When I went to Nepal, I was very well versed in interpretive anthropology, the study of symbols, symbolic transformations. There was a whole literature on symbolic healing, and I thought that I would understand how symbols and the invocation of people would change people, would heal them. But I found that was not really the case. And so I, like this whole research proposal on symbolic healing, and I had to throw it out after a month because I realized it was worthless. And I had to start again. And I really learned by being in the village, engaging with people in a very sort of embodied way. And that's when I started developing the sense of, aesthetic sensibilities of everyday life. And then paying attention to the healing ceremonies, I realized a lot of work was being done with the senses. So this is one of the things that I propose in this essay. Simply put, meme, again, this honorific term for a senior person, changes how a body feels by altering what it feels. His cacophony of music, taste, sight, touch, and kinesthesia activates the senses. The activation has the potential to wake up a person, alter the sensory grounds of a spiritless body, and so change how a person feels. So one of the things I'm arguing is that through this spirit calling ritual, a lot of the ritual work is actually being done to sort of like jumpstart a physiology, to engage the person in a much more vital way of being. And that observation coincides with the way people describe, like after a healing ceremony, which often takes a full night, they'll say they feel like they have this new charge in their body, that they feel more energized in a way. So there's something going on there, it seems to me. And one of the sort of affinities with this is these spirit calling rituals and chants that you find throughout the Tibetan area, going back centuries now. And this is one that I particularly like, where this is from late 19th century Tibetan and Mongolian Buddhist priests, they try to lure back the lost spirit of someone through this, this kind of prayer, this calling, this soul calling sort of ritual. And here it's translated into English, but your parents are here, your brothers and sisters are here, your friends and neighbors are here, and it goes on. And there's so much a focus on the here-ness, and in a way, they're invoking this kind of here-ness for the person who's lost their spirit, who would be listening to this. And again, this is an interpretation, but it strikes me that this is something we could pay attention to. In the article, I also talk about wild images. Actually, when I was reading this a few days ago, I'd actually forgotten this whole passage in the article because I hadn't read this article on title presence in probably 10 or 15 years. But it makes sense to me that these healers are invoking these wild images. And this is what I say there. By wild, I mean those images that leapfrog into the imagination and so engage the listener, not through any threaded storytelling, but through a random and roundabout slideshow of perceptions, a rock, a cave, a thoroughfare, that excites the senses and entices the imagination in a particular way. So if you imagine you're someone who you've lost your spirit and the healer's there, family members are there, neighbors are there, to call back the spirit, part of it is what you're imagining at the time and the sensory effects of that. Because the healer is going through these different places and there's this whole imaginary of finding the spirit and you're being sort of woken up in that way. So we can skip some of these because we'll be coming across these tomorrow. So this is sort of the thesis of the article, the conclusion. Memory tries to change how a person feels by altering the sensory stimuli around that person. This cacophony of music, taste, sight, touch, and wild tactile images activates the senses and the imagination. A Yomo healer jumpstarts the physiology. Even this book came out a good 30 years ago, and I think there's of everything I wrote about in that book, this is something I would still stand by, that something's going on along those lines. So that was the research, that first book, Body and Emotion, that's based on my PhD work. And at the time I was revising it for a book, I was a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard Medical School. I was working with medical anthropologists such as Byron Good and Arthur Kleiman. And I started working with Byron Good on a project to do this research ethnography in a homeless shelter. So it was actually a good method. In the morning, I was in my studio apartment in Cambridge, Mass, which at the time cost $215 a month. You can't find that now. And then in the afternoon, I would go to the shelter and do field work. And I did that for about a year, and eventually the book developed. But the book that came out of the work in the shelter is this one, Shelter Blues, Sanity and Selfhood Among the Homeless. And this is really, again, a very kind of critical phenomenological exploration of what life is like in the shelter for the people, and what are the people sort of dealing with in their lives, everything from the institutional structure of the shelter to living on the streets in Boston and what that means for them. It's also a shelter. In order to stay there, you have to have a diagnosis of mental illness. So these are people coming into the shelter with diagnoses of schizophrenia or manic depressive disorder, various sorts of things. And so that was also a key component of the research. So this is a book that I worked on for several years. And this is really, I started developing a method of writing that I call sort of writing intensities. Rather than developing a typical scholarly article with an argument, developing a thesis, providing information, that kind of more classical structure, which is very valid, really sort of focusing on intensities and working through those intensities through the writing process. So here's the table of contents of this book, and you can see there's so many of them that you're really moving from one intensity to the other throughout the whole book. And one of my students actually had read this at one point, and she said, this is very unsettling. You can't get out of it because there's no the typical chapter breaks or the parts, and you're just immersed in this text all the way through. And in some ways, I wanted that to happen because in some ways it reflects what it's like to live in the shelter. So this book is very much a critical phenomenology of experience, homelessness, and mental illness. And one of the articles that came out from that, which is also integrated within the book, is another one we'll be reading for tomorrow, Struggling Along the Possibilities of Experience Among the Homeless Mentally Ill, which came out in 97 or so, 96 or so, I imagine. And these are some of the things that I argue. And this is really where I developed this kind of approach to a critical phenomenology. I don't think I was doing that with the first book. I think my approach in Body and Emotion was rather straightforward. I thought you could just sort of study people's experiences by talking with them and you get a sense of them. And I realized working in the shelter is much more complicated than that. So this is what I sort of advance in this book. In my reckoning, we need a critical phenomenology that can help us not only to describe what people feel, think, or experience, but also to grasp how the processes of feeling or experiencing come about through multiple interlocking interactions. Such an approach is phenomenological because it would entail a close, unassuming study of phenomena of things themselves, how, for instance, people tend to feel in a certain cultural situation. But the approach is also critical in that it tries to go beyond phenomenological description to understand why things are this way, to inquire, for instance, into what we mean by feeling, how it comes about, what it implies, and what broader cultural and political forces are involved. In addition, the phenomenology is a critical one because it tries to take into account the makings of its own perceptions. And this is still the framework I keep coming back to. It makes sense to me, the same way other people, a different framework, like Woodrow practice theory or something like that. So the key idea is that you can look at any phenomena, like to give you an example, the experience of reading. And you could try to understand it, but you also have to keep in mind all the different forces that are shaping, say, a 4-year-old, girl's experience of reading in Berlin. You have to look at the institutional structures, the way they learn language, what a book is to them, all the dynamics that shape that experience of reading. So it's not enough to just do the phenomena. You have to look at all these different forces that are shaping the phenomena. And along the way, when I was working on this, I realized that I had to bracket the concept of experience itself. And again, bracketing is a key phenomenological principle that you sort of put aside your assumptions about something, and you try to look closely at something without your prejudgments of what that is. And I realized that at the time, we were using the concept of experience as if it was this kind of existential given in the world. It was a kind of natural thing, and people would say, "Oh, I'm studying the experience of mental illness, or the experience of healing, or spirit possession, or something like that." But once I stepped back a bit and kind of thought about it, people were using this concept of experience too easily. And I realized that we had to sort of like think about it in a more critical way. And so that's what's taking place in the Struggling Along essay that some of you have read. So this is sort of what I say there. I want to suggest that experience is not an existential given, but rather historical possibility predicated on a certain way of being in the world. Since this way of being is only one possibility among many, some people live in terms different from experience. So that's sort of the key analytic of the book and this article, and it was intentionally provocative to sort of say maybe experience is not as universal, maybe it's not the same thing for everyone throughout the world, and we have to be more critical about how we're using this term, not to throw it away altogether, but to be more clear about what we're thinking. Maybe experience is one way of life among many others. And the way I set that up, this is Foucault, we'll skip Foucault, as sometimes we do. These are sort of concepts that are questioned. So this whole critical phenomenological approach, I take a lot of these concepts and show that they don't quite apply for people's lives in the shelter in the way people often take them to mean or signify. Experience, agency, selfhood, body, feeling and sensation, language and rhetoric, mental illness. So, through all this series of writing intensities, these themes come into play. So agency, for instance, there's very much this sense, I think, in late capitalist discourse that people are agentive. They should be agentive. You should do something with your lives. You should be, step out into the world. But for the residents of the shelter, they were like, why should I be an agent in the world? Why do I have to go by that logic, that capitalist logic in a way? So that's just a simplified example of that. Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah, the idea that the body is this integrated domain of life. I think for the people in the shelter, it was much more of a kind of fragmented, multiplicity of different possibilities that was constantly shifting through time. I think as Deleuze has this concept of the body without organs, this idea that you step into this pure plenum of experience as a kind of positive thing. The way I think the residents in the shelter often felt is they were organs without a body, and they were troubled by different sort of dimensions of their bodies at different times. So again, it's not getting rid of a concept altogether, but working with it and showing how it takes on a particular formation. We can skip this, but I guess the key principle is that I shifted in my own work. I think I was rather naive about concept of experience and about language. And so what happened within this work is I sort of put experience sous voiture, as Derrida describes it, under erasure. And this is through some of his work, earlier work, that he would strike out a word such as presence, like that, to show that this is a word we often use, and sometimes we need to count on it. but we have to question its validity at the same time and sort of trouble its place in the world. And I was sort of doing that with the concept of experience. And in the article that we'll be discussing tomorrow, I counterbalance that with the concept of struggling along. So again, provocatively, I sort of argue, well, maybe the people don't really experience in the way we think experience works, as a kind of moving through time in a kind of integrative, coherent mode of being in the world, and they rather sort of struggle along, and it's sort of a counterpoint. But again, I knew I was making that argument just to provoke a different way of thinking. So that's the book I worked on. I hadn't been in Nepal for a good 8 years, and I went back in the summer of '97. And I started doing fieldwork again with Yomo people, mostly in the Bodanath area, because most of the people I knew had moved there. You know, and as any of you have been in Kathmandu know, it's a very kind of intense scene of, and I started working a lot with Karma Gyaltsen Lama, who I met while I was working on the Body and Emotion book, and we really started working in a close way, and very valuable, kind of anthropologist in his own right, a philosopher of Yomo culture. So that's been a kind of lifelong sort of relationship we've developed. And it actually took a while to find Karma, because I didn't have his address in the Bodanath area, which is the more Tibetan Buddhist area of Kathmandu. So we finally met, and I told him I was thinking of doing some more research and possibly on life histories of people from Yomo community. And I remember him saying, it's like, it's good you came back. And I said, yeah, it's good to be here. And he said, because when you left, you knew this much about us. You know, he just like went like this. And he said, now we can bring you, that's enough, that was enough to write one book, but now we can bring you up to here. And I was kind of offended, because he's saying, you only know this much, but it was actually true. And then through, again, this very sustained work and really learning better the Yomo language and more about Tibetan Buddhism, I do feel like my knowledge has developed. So each of these books, I think, is a more, I would say myself, a more knowledgeable, sophisticated understanding of Yomo lives. And here I started to work with two elders in particular. One is Gang Lama, who was the father of some people I knew from people who lived in Gopher who was in his mid-80s now. He was a Tibetan Buddhist priest, a Lama. He was also someone, had a good reputation of being a diviner, of reading astrological charts. So people would come to him and say, Meme, please see for me. And he would take out his charts and he would calculate the person's future, everything from a good day to get married, when to start some kind of work, when to travel in a way. But I'll come back to that. Here's an earlier photograph of him. I really didn't know him well until I started doing this work. And the other person I started working with was Kisang Omu, who was in her mid-80s as well, and very fragile, very much limited to her bed. And the method, really, the main method of this work was to go to these two elders and talk with them about their lives. I would come with questions, and we'd do interviews. Usually I would come with a translator, and we'd be using Nepali and Yomo, and then working in English as well, in terms of the translation. And the whole book is structured on that. So this is the cover image of the book, which I'm not so fond of, because the publisher wanted to do this, I forget what it's called, sepia? Is that it? This kind of yellow tint. And many of you know you can't argue with publishers so much about the cover images, and they get offended if you don't like the colors. So that's the cover of the book. I'm not sure Gang Lama would have thought well of it either. But this is the title, Sensory Biographies, and the whole idea of the analytic frame is the idea that there's two sensory biographies in the book, primarily of Gang Lama and Kisang Omu. And one of the things I noticed while doing the fieldwork is that Kisang Omu's world was one of voices mostly, of sounds, of acoustics, and the moral weight of them. So one of the first stories she told us was when she got married around 15 years old by force, that this wedding party came to her house. She didn't know these people, and her father, who was an important Buddhist priest, a Lama, had arranged this marriage. And she had to travel a 2-day walk to this other village on a mountainside, and that's where she made her life. But the way she described it was all through voices. She did the voice of her brother, her older brother, say, "Hey, little sister, father's up to no good. You have to go and hide. You have to go and hide." And she's like, she's describing that. And all the narratives had this kind of moral dimension to sound and to people's voices, because that's the world, the life world of her. For Gang Lama, it was very much one of vision, of knowing the world through seeing, of knowledge through these Buddhist texts, of the truth of those. And a lot of his metaphors were ones of vision as well. So that's the sort of key principle of the book. And here I also worked with, along with Karma, Gyaltsen Lama, Tenma Dompa Yomo. This is him with his family, and he was very helpful with doing the interviews and translations and interpretations. So this is the theme of the sensory biographies of the truth things. So one of the key articles that came out of this is Echoes of a Yomo Buddhist Life and Death. And this came out in Cultural Anthropology in 2000. And the key concept here is this concept of bhaja that I learned from Gang Lama, which means echo. And there's a kind of reverberation that happens, in a canyon where like our understanding of echo, you say way and you hear these reverberations. But it also coincides with the theory of karma, that everything has reverberations through time. And I realized in talking with Gang Lama, he would invoke this term to say that this life history work is going to be a bhaja of me. And I was like, what do you mean by that? How is it an echo? He said, oh, well, I'm not going to live forever. This will be an echo of who I am and who I was. And people will know me through this. And they'll know that I was a good person in life. And so this became a key metaphor to really unpack the significance of bhaja and to show how it works in how Gang Lama himself perceived of his life and the work we did together. Moving on from there, I had a certain epiphany one day because I was working so much on these themes of death. And I started working on a book on dying and death for Yomo people through the whole sort of course of a teaching year. And I remember one day, it was just the beginning of the summer, and I parked my car, close to where I live. And I said, that was a good parking job. It was right between the white lines. If I could have a death like that, so clear cut and, just like a good parking space, that would be a good death. And then I realized, like, what am I doing? I'm like, at that time, I was like in my early 40s. I'm too young to be thinking about death all the time. So I actually just put aside that book manuscript, and it collected dust for like 8 years. And I don't think I wrote much anthropology. I played chess. I started going to the city, Manhattan, and local chess clubs, and I just started playing chess just for the fun of it. I wasn't thinking I was going to do anything anthropological with it. I was just, became obsessed with playing the game. I played as a teenager, but I gave it up when I went to grad school, and I came back to it. And then eventually I realized I could maybe write a book. And so this is the book that came out of it, Counterplay, an anthropologist of the chessboard. And in many ways, it's an auto-ethnography of chess playing. You could even say an auto-phenomenology of chess playing and chess players. I talk about this idea of an anthropology of passion. I don't really do much with it, as one reviewer pointed out, like, oh, he invokes his anthropology of passion, but there's no conceptual, development of that idea. So it's in some ways, very straightforward. And I look at all the different dimensions of chess, everything from using computers today to the competitive aspect, to learning the game, to how the mind works, the phenomenology of playing chess. And it was a fun project. And even in the writing, I'm a kind of the narrative consciousness through it all, but sometimes I switch from first person to second person to third person. So one whole chapter is in the you voice. You show up at the Marshall Chess Club at 10 o'clock on a Saturday morning, and you see your first opponent is a Russian chess master named Vladimir, Gutchikin. And so the whole narrative takes form that way, and sort of this kind of showing through these narrative accounts of what's involved with chess. This is the first paragraph, for instance. Khan, he was a chess buddy at the time. Khan's got a bishop aimed at my king's side. I never thought I would write anthropologically this way. He's staring at the guts of my position, looking for weaknesses, and it goes on from there. So you can see very much a kind of narrative encounter, and this is like one of the key themes of the book. Chess gets a hold of some people like a virus or a drug, and it was the case with me. Just as the chemical properties of heroin directly immediately affect the central nervous system, so chess can lock into certain pathways of the mind, and it doesn't easily let go. And I think it's similar to people, we know people who play video games a lot or really get caught up with, was it Wordle? That's what's like popular in the US. So you see this kind of back and forth. And then I went back to Nepal. I finished the book on chess, and then I picked up this manuscript, literally blew off the dust that was sitting on the shelf. And I realized I needed to finish this book, Subject to Death, Life and Loss in a Buddhist World. So this is the book that came out in 2017. And this is just the photograph from the cover image. So you can see, and these are prayer flags off the hill. So again, I worked with Temba and Karma on this. And this book is really, you can see my typos here. Freud would find that interesting, dying, not dying, but dying and death among Yomo Buddhists. And the book is very much a kind of takes the reader through the different through a very kind of temporal way, all the different dimensions of dying and death. from, the processes of dying and how families come to support people, to how the Tibetan Buddhist priests deal with a dead body and transfer the namshe, the soul of the person outside of the body, to the cremation ceremonies. These are photographs from that, to the funeral rites. And so a lot of these photographs are through 20 years of different times of field work. To the gur, the effigy of the deceased, and a lot of these themes are mentioned in one of the readings we're doing for tomorrow. Lamden, the showing the road, to the dismantling of the effigy, to sending the namshe of the person to another existence, to the very sort of more serious mani prayers that end the funeral rites, that then lead to songs and dance later in the evening. And this is the contents of the book. Again, thanks to Google Books Online. And you could see very much this approach to intensities. The reader works through all the different themes, starting from the moments when people start thinking about their own death and the possibilities of dying, through the whole ritual process, to the transformations occur within that. And the key theme of this book is this kind of what I came to call poesis in living and dying. By poesis, I mean sort of generative fashioning, creative making. I think a lot of our work in this room, my sense, is dealing with poesis. How do you create things? How do you create this kind of generative sort of faculties and principles in the world? And this is something, that I tried to think through. The living and the recently dead are thus engaged in delicate technologies of cessation and transformation. Dying calls for an active patterning of self and other, as do the funerary rites. So this theme of poesis is this kind of making, this generative fashioning. And you can find this concept in Greek philosophy, in Plato and Aristotle, and Martin Heidegger writes about it, Hannah Arendt, and some anthropologists. And at first I was concerned that this was too much of a Western concept, but then by that time, Karma and Temba were living in Queens, New York. And I would go to visit them and I would show them what I was writing, like for this book. And so I showed them this section on poesis, and they said, yeah, this makes sense to us perfectly, automatically, because this is what Yomo life is like, is about creating, generative fashioning, everything from, how you make a person, how parents make their children, not just biologically, but as persons in the world, to ritual transformations, to working with businesses, to taking on creative endeavors. So that kind of clicked in a way. And so that became the key concept. And these are some of the ways that I saw that poesis the forms that it can take, both for Yomo people, but in life more generally, to make new things, more or less concrete or virtual, to alter or fashion the appearances of the world, to shape or change the consciousness of someone or something, to construct memories, to change the form of someone or something, to teach something significant, and so on, all the way through. And I think this is like themes that are in the article for tomorrow. Each of these efforts plays a central role in how Yomo people go about their lives, as well as how they tend to moments of death and loss. So, rituals performed, consciousnesses are fashioned and refashioned in healing ceremonies and funeral ceremonies, and selves are made. But also selves are unmade. Okay, so I talk about what I call a poesis of cessation. So the problem when someone dies is you have to deal with the body, for one, and you have to deal with the dissolution of that self, of that person. And the ritual form transformations are really to unmake a person. And so much of the dying process and the cremation and funeral rites orbits around an intricate making of unmaking, a calm forging of undoing, dissolving, and stillness. And this is something that Karma and Tempa agreed with, so we went with this way of conceptualizing this material. You could also talk about a co-poesis, when people work together, of a collaborative fashioning and sometimes unfashioning of self and other. I heard earlier that a lot of you are co-writing articles together. So I'd say that's a kind of co-poesis, and hopefully you won't be dismantling the other through that. There's a poesis on behalf of another. We do things on behalf of other people. And that's what the funeral rites are about. All this work of the funerals is to unmake a person. And you're doing this out of this compassionate need to dissolve the existence of a person. So these are lots of words about this, what I call the ritual poesis. And so really the rituals, the funeral rites, are an intricate play of presence and absence. And this is something I write about in that article. And one aspect of the rites that is worth noting here is that a series of tangible images of the deceased serve to simulate the deceased's identity as it changes through time. Each of these images is first invoked and then taken away by either being burned or dismantled. So these are all the photographs I just showed. And really, if you look at the larger logic of the funeral rites, starting from the moment when someone gets seriously ill and is, often seen as being on their deathbed, and family members and neighbors come to visit, is this transformation of the self. And what often occurs is they invoke an image of a deceased person, and then they take it away in some way. So actually, the first one is actually a corpse that's being brought to the house, and it really becomes a deity, but then through the cremation rites, it's dissolved, it's deconstituted. And then they create this effigy. And then that effigy is taken away through different times of the healing rites. And so there's constantly this invocation of something, of the form of the life, and then that life is taken away. And it sort of occurs, it becomes more and more abstract, this process through time as well. And one of the things that you could think about is that the bundles, the shamanic healers, that their transformations are about reconstituting a body, a spirit, and a life, whereas the Yoma Buddhists, death rituals are about deconstituting a body. And I've never written about this in a kind of extensive way, but they kind of mirror each other. And I would imagine in other places in the world it's similar. That healing rites reconstitute a person, and death rituals and funeral rites deconstitute the person. Probably there's a structural relationship in how they work. So another aspect of the article that we're discussing tomorrow is a whole reflection on learning how to die. And so there's this famous quote from Cicero: "To philosophize is to learn how to die." And as Seaman Critchley, I don't think that's spelled correctly, a British philosopher, says, the main task of philosophy in this view is to prepare us for death, to provide a kind of training for death, the cultivation of an attitude towards a finitude that faces down the terror of annihilation without offering promises of an afterlife. So there's a long history of philosophers thinking about this quote: to philosophize is to learn how to die. But one of the things maybe we could ask is to anthropologize also to learn how to die. Through the kind of work that anthropologists do, can you get a better sense of life as well as death? And that's something that I ask. And this is a quote in that article. Can an anthropology of death and dying teach one how to die, and thus how to live? And I think this is an important consideration during this time of profound global transformations, of environmental transformations, global warming and such. In a way, you could think about the Anthropocene as a kind of process of dying of many life forms, but also a kind of reconstitution of life forms. And so that's something I've been thinking about. How can we make sense of dying during the Anthropocene? What does that mean? And can we think about it in a kind of Buddhist way in that respect? This quote that I've written about is by Maurice Blanchot, the French thinker: a strange insect-like buzzing on the margins. And the reason I put this here is because Blanchot was very interested in these strange moments of alterity and radical alterity in life, including sort of moments of disaster, of a breakdown of subjectivity or language. And this is often how the way I think about environmental change is this kind of strange insect-like buzzing on the margins. We know it's happening, and it's just this kind of strange thing that's happening. We don't often see it directly, but we know that this is happening, and it's unsettling for us. One side project I did is I went back to Gopher in 2012, and that's when I really started getting interested in photography and images. And I did what I undertook at the time, I thought of as fieldwork in photography. And I've only written one article that touches on this work. This one's seared with reality, phenomenology through photography. So one of the things I was asking is, can photography, particularly a kind of anthropological photography, can that be a good method for a kind of critical phenomenology? So that's what I was exploring. And this is a photograph I took of a stool. I think this article, it's the first sentence is, when I went to Gopher one summer to take photographs, I fell in love with a blue stool, and I really did fall in love with this stool, and it just seemed was so well together. I really wanted to photograph it, and there's a certain color here and everything. So the whole article is about reflection on the phenomenology of photography. How does photography work in the world as a phenomena? Photography as a phenomenology, and what I came to call phenomenography, of using photography, mixing these words ethnography and photography with phenomenology. And these are just some of the images, if you'll indulge me, that I took at the time. And of course, when the article was published, nothing was in color. It was all black and white. And through this work, I really looked at dynamics of personhood, of care, of relationality, of presence and co-presence and poesis through that work. One reason I'm showing this image is this is where Gang Lama He was brought back to this village of Todong, which is close to the Gulf of Majang, and this is where his site of his cremation. And this is his grandson, who, when I was first doing field work, he was born. This is Sangye Lama. And they had a copy of this book here. And so it's very striking to see that they valued the book that I wrote about their grandfather. I went to Meme Bumble's house, and they had a copy of the book Body and Emotion. And these are photographs. And this is the last time I met with Meme Bumble. He, at the time, he was said he was in the time of dying, which was actually the case. He died a few months later. This is his son with him, who was also a healer. And this is a photograph that was taken of me, and you can see the sadness of, saying goodbye to my mentor, my guru, in that respect. This is me learning how to make bread with Pasang Lama. And one thing that's striking is this is on the upper corner is Pasang Lama, is maybe a 6-year-old boy. And this is him in 2012, and now it's 11 years later. Pasang lives in Queens. He works in a restaurant. He's a very skilled volleyball player. He's on a team that travels across the country. So again, this theme of knowing these people's lives. This is Latu Lama, who I've known. I want to sort of mention this article, this photograph by Paul Strand of Mr. Bennett, titled Mr. Bennett, Vermont, from 1944. And this is what John Berger wrote about Paul Strand's photography. He said they convey a unique sense of duration. And Berger is writing and says, one has the strange impression that the exposure time is the lifetime. And I think that's the case with like photographs I've taken of people through these 30 years of fieldwork with Yomo people. And I think it applies to fieldwork for many of us, that it's a whole lifetime of our own work and the people we work with, and even generations in that respect. So the last main project I could talk about is this work, The Blind Man, a Phantasmography, which someone described as a wild book. And this came out in 2019. This is where I was really interested in photography. And I started traveling around through France, and particularly in Paris, and going to this one site that some of you might be familiar with, the Basilique de Sacré-Cœur, which very much is a touristed site. And I just found this kind of fantastical space of images, and the making of images. And this is one photograph I took at the time of a man who was panhandling and presumably blind, but I'm not sure. And I really got fascinated with what the dynamics of this particular photograph. And that led me into a very kind of fantastical journey through a year and a half, traveling through different parts of France, thinking about images and writing about images, and how I got caught up in this, what I came to call a kind of phantasmography of writing of phantasm, to the effect that I actually, my own vision started getting affected through this project. So this is something we could discuss tomorrow too. And these are some of the images from the article, The Phantasmography, that short essay that really explored the dynamics of these images. Just I wanted to show these, and it's clear that I didn't include the person's face, but this is the man I write about, who I think is performing a certain kind of figure of the human in an effort to get money. And there's a lot going on within that performance that I write about. And this is where I sort of developed this concept of phantasmography. Such inquiries as conveyed in these pages lead not so much to any clear and direct ethnography, to the writing of a people's way of life, than they do a phantasmography, a writing of phantasms, a graphic inscription of the flows and currents of fantasy and fabulation. So this is where I really started working and developing this concept of the phantasm. And as I note in that book, and I think the article, it's considered here in the variable sense of an apparition or illusion, a ghost or phantom, an imaginary construct, a fantastical image or vision, a haunting memory, a fanciful idea, a coherent fantasy, momentary, lifelong, conscious or unconscious. This book then is a compendium of phantasms. So it is really, it moves from sort of a series of imaginings through time. And there's a lot going on here, but I even identify myself at a certain time as a phantom, for I'm a phantom, you see. And then I'm in a way a phantasm, and I argue in the book that everyone who's reading it is a phantasm in some ways. So it really raises the interesting questions about image, representation, identity, the nature of life more generally. And this is a quote. This goes back, I forget who this is. It goes back, I think, all the way to Plato, Aristotle. Take care in playing with phantoms, one becomes a phantom. And it's really, I think it would have been Plato, I think, writing about theater. You have to be careful if you play a certain role in the theater, because you could become that character, as we all know, that's the case. But if you're really writing about phantoms, maybe you could become a phantom yourself. So in a playful way, I developed this concept of phenomenology. And whenever I type this into Word changes it back to phenomenology. So I'm constantly, even with this PowerPoint, I had to correct it several times. And the idea here is that it all goes back to this Indo-European root word, the pho. And the asterisk signifies that people don't know how it was pronounced. But it then branched out this earlier concept, this earlier sort of linguistic term, to these three dimensions of appearance. One is related to the word pho that we have in photon and photography, an appearance of light. And then you have phenomena with the phi, and phenomenology, the appearance of some phenomena in the world, what appears. But the other side of it is also the fa, the appearance of a phantom, something more illusionary or magical or fantastical. And I got interested in the relationships between these three and really tried to stress the phantom-like, phantasmal qualities of life. So I've been, toying with this word phenomenology. I'm the only one who uses it, so that says something too. But we can discuss it tomorrow. So this is actually drawn from a handout when I teach about critical phenomenology, and this is the summation point, which I'll end with. So what is called for? A careful, non-naive, bracketing, dynamic, critical phenomenological approach in anthropology. So each of these we could spend a whole, hour on, realized through ethnographic field research methods that attends at once to the subjective and intersubjective actualities of people's lives and the often interrelated social, psychological, and so on and so forth. So again, you see the same theme that's been recurring through all my work. So we have the archipelago again, and maybe the archipelago of today has been something like this. These are the different islands we visited, and we can go back to these islands tomorrow. They'll still be there. And then the final work that I just came out a year and a half ago is Traces of Violence, Writings on the Disaster in Paris, France, where I'm looking really at the after effects of recent acts of political violence, both the attacks in November 2015, where a series of bars and cafes and music venues in Paris were attacked and people died and others were seriously injured. And then the co-author Halil Habri has been studying police violence in the northern parts of Paris and the after effects, the traces of violence in people's lives in that respect. But perhaps that will come up tomorrow as well. So in a way, hopefully that gives you a kind of a grounding of my kind of work, and I thank you for listening. And again, I'm honored to have, no one's heard this before, neither my students or my colleagues or my mother. So it gives me a chance. I think I'm going to send her the recording of this, and she'll see what my whole life has been about. Thank you, Mom. So thank you.